Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis books, and I'm very glad to be joined today by our author, Libby Osgood, who is an aerospace engineer who worked on NASA satellites. She teaches sustainable design engineering at the University of Prince Edward Island in Canada. She's also a member of a religious order, the Congregation of Notre de Montreal. So in other words, she is a nun who is also a rocket scientist. And if that were the premise of a miniseries, I promise you I'd watch it. With Kathleen Deignan, she previously edited our book Teilhard de Chardin, A Book of Hours, which is a devotional work based on the writings of the great Jesuit who also integrated science and spirituality. Her new book, which she has edited, is called Green Saints for a Green Generation, with a beautiful cover. And I think a good way to start, Libby, would be to unpack some of the words in that title, maybe beginning with what you mean by saints, who they are, what they mean, what they function, why do they matter?
Sure. I think the saints are the people who inspire us, right? And the beautiful thing about the Catholic tradition is, in the Christian tradition in general, is we have exemplars. We have these people that can show us kind of pointing towards holiness. What are some practical things that we can do? What is some evidence-based, as an engineer, what are things we can do here on earth to get closer to Christ, to get closer to living the gospel message, that the saints show us the way. And in the Catholic tradition, we have the canonized saints that have gone through the whole rigorous process of being acknowledged, but we also have so many examples around us of people who are doing great things. So, the title of the book is both the canonized and the non-canonized, that we kind of can refer to as ecological witnesses, or witnesses more so. But, as we come up to the All Saints Day, All Souls Day here in the next week, um, we have so many beautiful examples of the people who inspire us to do better.
And the book does include both traditional canonized saints like John of the Cross and Ignatius of Loyola, but also many others who would not be candidates for canonization. I love the way that you integrated those. So now let's back up one word and talk about what are green saints?
Yeah, well, that phrase, we talk about greenwashing everything, or we talk about re-examining things by adding looking through a different lens. Um, and green saints is the idea that um, when we examine what we're doing, we can do so with a particular lens. And green saints are doing so with an ecological lens. But rather than saying the ecological saints, green is the current buzzword that just evokes imagery of the earth. It evokes trees. It evokes that, really rich, verdant nature. So I like the phrase green saints because it's a little bit more catchy. But also it's who are the people, who are the wise ones that can inspire us towards ecological action, towards ecologically doing our part for the earth, with a very Laudato Si sort of
Mhm.
feel.
I thought what was fascinating is that, as you point out, there are certain saints that come immediately to our mind when we think about ecology. Saint Francis probably be
Of course.
chief among them. He doesn't actually appear in this book. Hildegard of Bingen, Celtic saints, that sort of thing. But what's so fascinating is that you have chosen, or the authors have chosen, figures that we don't associate with ecology, but what you talk about, reading them through an ecological lens or a kind of green view.
Yeah.
And actually, I think one of the inspirations for you doing this book came from an essay that you wrote on the criteria for a green saint. Uh, could you bring to mind what some of those criteria are?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the inspiration for the Green Saints are that as a religious sister, we at our last chapter, we decided to focus on a couple of things. And one of the things is care for our common home. So I looked to my own life and said, how can I, as an engineer and a sister, how can I do my part? And I realized, well, let's examine our foundress. What did our foundress have to say about ecological action? And Saint Marguerite Bourgeois lived in the 17th century,
Mhm.
and in Canada and France. And what would she have to say about ecological action? Like, why? It was kind of a perplexing question. So I started down the road to consider it. And then I said, well, what is a green saint? What does it mean to be for a saint to be ecological or not? And I started to look and I couldn't find any really almost anything written about green saints for as much as we have on sustainability and all of that. So I started at Laudato Si, as you do. And the Pope mentions, as you said, St. Francis and numerous saints. Hildegard Hildegard doesn't come up a lot in that text, but a number of saints, Saint Teresa of the Little Way, and there's so many saints. Saint John of the Cross comes up quite a bit, and I think more locally here in Canada and the U.S., Saint Kateri Tekakwitha. She's very known, particularly for her indigenous spirituality and integrating natural ecology. So, of those main saints, I looked at them and said, well, what's similar about them? And developed this framework of, okay, there's six things. And one of them, they're frequently immersed in the natural world. They can't help but to be in nature. Another thing about them is they have these fantastically large stories, the hagiographies, right? They were such incredible people that the people were inspired to do even bigger stories about them, and things like the Celtic saints conversing with animals. One of the Celtic saints enlisting an oxen to help, or enlisting a bear because his ox died to help carry heavy boulders. But yeah, there were those six criteria. And I thought, wow, because this doesn't exist, let's re-examine a number of other saints. Who are the people, who are our beloved saints that we turn to for everything else? Why wouldn't we turn to them to help us to be more ecological? So that's really where the book started from.
Well, many of the authors apply that to particular people, and in really interesting, surprising ways that makes you think about them in a completely different way. I mean, among your criteria was kind of an awareness of an experience of divinity in nature, uh, and also interesting, a countercultural adherence to nature, you say. So yeah, everybody was farmers or peasants, something like that, but they approached creation in a way that kind of was against the prevailing cosmology or sense of science or creation. One of the ones that really interested me was Ignatius of Loyola,
Yeah.
because again, it wouldn't come right to your mind. But the author talks about the role of creation in his own mystical kind of experience and how tied it was. She calls him, he was a stargazer. He liked to look up at the heavens all the time. But, one of his great mystical experiences occurred next to a river, and he had this deep, transforming sense that he kind of had this understanding of everything. And then she also then applies his spirituality, his uh, his principles of discernment and examination of conscience, how those would apply with an ecological consciousness.
Yeah, Sister Jessie Beck wrote that chapter, and it's exactly what was my intention with the book. It really was because, the Jesuits, there's many examples of ecological Jesuit networks and different things that they're doing. And I think that really does go back to their founder and the way that he wrote things and how he wrote things. I had the great pleasure of doing a 30-day retreat in Loyola this past summer, and of course edited the book, before that. So being immersed in his home, in the beauty of where he lived, you can so see that he adored nature. And when you do the spiritual exercises through a lens of an ecological lens or a green lens, oh my gosh, it's everywhere.
Well,
Um,
it's all about our nature as creatures,
yeah,
which and our relation to all of creation.
yeah.
So our relation with God, with other people, but with the world itself. So
Our,
it's all permeates his spirituality.
Oh, exactly. The creatureliness and that is one of the things of finding divinity through nature, in nature, which also is so Teilhardian. I mean, I know
Mhm.
I have to slip him in. The fact that there's not a chapter on him is shocking,
Yeah,
but
shocking.
it goes into Sister Celia's chapter on Saint John of the Cross. He squeezes his way in, and he gets in my chapter a little bit too. But it's so Teilhardian, that notion of finding God in nature, that panentheism of seeing God everywhere, seeing
Mhm.
the beauty of what God has done. And that's so Ignatian. that I,
Mhm.
frankly, being on retreat with in Ignatius's hometown, I almost felt like I was on retreat with Teilhard, figuring out how his Jesuitness led him to so many of his beliefs as well. Um, yeah, it's great to see how the saints inspire other people that inspire us, right?
Mhm.
And thus,
Mhm.
it's that cyclical nature of we just get bigger and bigger and bigger in terms of paying attention to the things that are important.
Well, let's go back to the title again. And
Yeah.
the other part of that, a green generation, green saints for a green generation. Uh, Talk about that and unpack that audience.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's unique about this book is that the people who are writing are all my age and and younger. And that was really intentional. For one, you mentioned the book with Kathleen doing the Book of Hours, and I have grown up adoring books, just
Mm.
adore, they're my best friends, so to say. So
Mhm.
she helped to demystify that process of what are the actual steps towards writing a book? And it wasn't as mystical and magical as
Mm.
I had in my brain. So, in doing that with her, I realized, oh my gosh, rather than me doing an entire book on green lens on each of the saints, wouldn't it be fabulous if we could get a whole group of people together to each write about their own process and thus bring them into the book writing process and demystify that for them? So, I sought out scientists and sisters and emerging theologians because the ecological realm invites so many different perspectives and we all
Mm.
need each other. We can't just
Mm.
have the scientists talking, we can't just have the theologians talking, we need that cross section. So it's a long way to get to your question of what does a green generation mean, but the green generation is essentially saying from my earliest memories, the first commercial I remember seeing was on PBS, and it was the little fish losing its water because I was
Mm.
taking too much water to brush my teeth.
Mm.
The fish in the pond was the water was getting lower and lower. I remember being worried that the elephants were becoming extinct and the
Mm.
different animals that were going extinct from my earliest memories. So I believe that I connect myself with the millennial generation. Um, there's never been a time that I haven't known we were in an ecological, maybe not crisis, but certainly when I grew up, we were worried. We were definitely aware of an ecological change of the earth. And I would say that's only grown with Gen Z and now Gen Alpha, that it's just gotten bigger and bigger. So as you read the different chapters, each of these authors has grown up in a time that they've always been worried about the earth, that this is just their lived reality.
Mm.
So it's not just, I often forget whether the book title is from or for. Saints for a green generation or from a green
It's
generation.
it's it's
Because
for it's for.
it is for, but it could be both because
Both from.
part of
Mhm.
it is the green generation speaking out and saying and taking on the work that our forebearers have done to say this needs to change and these things need to be paid attention to, taking that on and taking the responsibility and saying yes, and we need to do things too. So
Well, what was striking about about the authors in this generation is that you are maybe naturally attuned to the priority that Pope Francis has given to this subject, and it's in striking contrast with I would say leadership of the church in America and in most parishes don't hear very much about this, where he has really talked about in Laudato Si an ecological conversion and the fact that care for the earth is an integral expression of our faith. And then in his most recent document, Laudato Deum, he becomes even more urgent, saying, you didn't listen to what I said in Laudato Si." He's like really giving us another chance.
yeah.
And so this generation is hearing that and responding, appropriately.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I talk about the different encyclicals, I love how you put it because I do the same. I say Laudate Deum is y'all aren't listening. Why
Yeah.
aren't y'all listening?
Yeah.
And he gives some interesting reasons, to do with media and different things like that, that the message isn't getting out there. And I name it in the introduction. I have yet to hear it being preached from the pulpit. The everyday Catholic, I don't hear it. And I don't understand why when it is one of the things that the Pope is talking about. And it's part of our social justice,
Mhm.
right? Care for our common home or some language of that. is part of that. And most certainly because of the integral ecology that Pope Francis talks so beautifully about, that the poorest among us are the most affected by these changes. And I think that's part of why we in Western society might be able to close our eyes a little bit, because it's not hitting us in the same way,
Mm.
except when you see, the hurricane coming through Florida and North Carolina and all of those things. Until we can really be impacted, the call isn't as strong for so many people. And it's kind of what I was hoping to do with this book, is to, by having 12 different people each write a chapter, that's 12 different networks
Mm.
that are hopefully talking about this in a bigger way. Because it was surprisingly hard to find authors who are able to write or willing to write, and meet the criteria of caring about ecological action.
Mm.
Um, that it's such a cross section of people that we need more. So this is,
Mm.
for me, almost a rallying cry of, we need more. How do we do that? And I really like the last chapter in the book, because that's, I think, my response is that all of these people can inspire us, both the canonized and the non-canonized. I love talking about, Toni Morrison. People don't
Mm.
realize she converted to Catholicism. Many people don't
Mm.
realize that, when she was a child. And so in her writings, it talks about how she uses earth imagery and how that really connects with her writings, so she can inspire us in that way. And one of our authors, Elizabeth Iwuma, introduced Ken Saro-Wiwa, who I'd never heard of, from Nigeria, a Nigerian. He wasn't Catholic, but he did care deeply about the petroleum industry and how that was just gutting Nigeria's economy and has changed it so dramatically. And he
Mm.
did die. He was an earth martyr in support of pushing back against big oil. So what's kind of neat about the second half of the book is it's introducing us to these people who are in modern day doing things that we need to stand up and take notice. One of them is still alive, Sister Paula Gonzalez,
Yes.
and our author had an interview with her. She's working in the Amazon.
Not
Um,
Paula Gonzalez. That was a different
oh,
chapter.
I'm
That
sorry,
was
not, yes, thank you, not Paula Gonzalez.
she did die.
Yeah, she's in North America and did some really early work with
Yeah.
solar panels and bringing that into religious life. But Sister Laura Vicuña, yeah,
Exactly. Yes.
and she's doing incredible work in the Amazon right now. So
Mm.
I love that. And then the last chapter is, and us, how we're
Mm.
all called to be these ecological saints. It's not just
Mm.
uh, often, wasn't it Dorothy Day who had that famous line about "Don't call me a saint, everyone will dismiss me"? I know I'm saying that wrong.
Yeah, yeah. I had a role in popularizing that, which I sort of regret. Um, but
But
yes,
it's so
no.
true.
We tend to. If I really I wanted to get to that point in the last chapter, because it's true that when we focus on these heroic and paradigmatic kind of figures, we think, oh, the saints. Well, I can never be like that. And really, what you're talking about in the last chapter on biodiversity is saying that all of this is a call to us to become green saints, and which because and that's not some new thing. I mean, that's kind of a standard teaching of the church, that we are called to be saints. Doesn't mean canonized or having a church named after us or something like that, but that our lives are infused with the gospel, and we reflect the love of God through mercy and compassion and justice, and loving God and loving our neighbor. And that includes, our neighbor also includes all of the creatures of the earth. I I there was talking about your own biography and combining your religious identity and your vocation as a scientist. And what's fascinating, when you look at it with this kind of lens, is to see how the kind of insights of the great mystics converges with the understanding of science, especially around the whole question of our interrelatedness, how everything is one, how we are embedded in all of creation, as opposed to thinking as human beings that we're somehow set apart or independent, or the earth is just some sort of resource that we use.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the six indicators of that framework that started this whole thing, was that we are so interconnected. So even trying to find language to talk about the natural world as if we're not in it, as if
Mm.
we're not 100% part of it, and not only our impact on it, but our how we're influenced by it. that, yeah, that interrelatedness is so important. I think that last chapter talking about biodiversity, um, it's something that we as scientists, or I'm an engineer, I don't claim to be a scientist, but that we recognize is so important. When we become too monolithic, when we become too streamlined, you lose the great diversity that allows us to flourish.
Mhm.
And so I think just like in our Catholic faith, we need to see ourselves not just as the potential to be saints or saints in training, so to
Mhm.
say, on a path to holiness, but we need to see that the call to ecology is inherently part of that. Just like we're inherently part of the natural world, it's not separate. It's not an add-on. It is our call. It is what God wants us to do. The Garden of Eden, as the beautiful allegory that it is, starts with us immersed throughout. And
Mhm.
we had the responsibility to name things. We had the responsibility to care for things, but it didn't say, y'all aren't part of that, right? That
Mhm.
we're deeply entrenched in that. So we have to get back to that call that it's not something we should do. It's literally our duty. It's our earliest call is to recognize that we're part of this world.
Yeah. On that theme, I should point out that there's a foreword to the book by the great feminist theologian Elizabeth Johnson. We just published her most recent book is called Come Have Breakfast, Meditations on God and the Earth. I'm not trying to advertise that, but just that she is a person who was a kind of pioneer first in her kind of feminist understanding of God, of the communion of saints. She wrote a fabulous book about that. And her most recent work has been looking at ecology and how we are rereading our faith in light of climate crisis and our relation to creation. So she has a wonderful introduction where she sets up a lot of the themes here, but I almost felt like she was passing the baton, to a new generation now. So excited that all of you, younger theologians or emerging scholars or scientists or whatever, are kind of seizing on that call.
Oh yeah. Well, I must say I emailed her and read and reread and reread and read the email before I was finally like, do I? Do I? I had the
Mhm.
great pleasure to take an ecological theology course from her at Fordham her last semester of teaching. And I, as an engineer, have never taken a theology course previously, and that was quite a big jump into because I teach in sustainable design engineering, but really wasn't aware of how rooted ecology is in our tradition. So she, week by week, went through each ology of the church, pneumatology, all of them, and said, how does ecology apply to this? And we used, Ask the Beasts as much of that book, one of her earlier works. Um, so it only felt right because it really that idea of a green gaze came up in her class. So it really only felt right to ask her to do the forward because so
Mhm.
much of this the seeds were from her class. There's no question of this book came to be, this idea came to be because of learning ecological necessity in her ecological theology course. So she was so gracious to write the foreword and replied immediately, yes, absolutely. I'd love to make time for this. And I was just so grateful.
Mhm.
And then her foreword fills holes that I didn't realize I had, that I didn't explain. And I'll just leave it at that so people can read it. But she
Mhm.
set such a beautiful foundation for what the whole book is and needs to be and who the saints are that I thought, oh, and she continues to inspire me and continue to teach me, years after that class.
It's a really beautiful and wonderful entry to the book. I'd like to give you an opportunity to expand a little bit on your own chapter on Marguerite Bourgeois. That was absolutely fascinating to me, and the way you applied those criteria of Green Saint to her, beginning with her uh, deep humility and what that means, her relationship to creation, well, I'll let you speak about her.
Sure. Well, and it is the way that I got Teilhard in there too, eh? And a little bit about space, because I can't help but talk about the astronauts in space,
No,
given,
of course
the foundation.
not.
But yeah, I think what's part of what's interesting about Marguerite Bourgeois, she's, as I said, a 17th century saint who came to Canada in 1653, and she was many first. She was the first canonized Canadian woman. She was the first teacher of Montreal, Canada. She came to Montreal when it was very, very small, and we think of her witness often in her writing. She talks about teaching us to be simple and humble like pumpkins and cabbages.
Yeah.
So if you imagine, 17th century Canada, there wouldn't have been a lot growing. And in those long, cold winters, the pumpkins and cabbages, even though they probably weren't the most exciting thing, they were sustenance.
Yeah.
And this time of year, how much do we love our pumpkin spice, whatever, right? But I think upon further reflection in that initial paper that I did for Zygon, I did apply the 6 criteria to her in a much more framework kind of way and said, for this framework, here's what she did, for this framework.
Mhm.
But this chapter was more about integrating those and saying her witness in general, it was her radical humility that can teach us all to be more humble, that can teach us all that being humble is a stance that cares for the earth. Because even that word humble, humility, humus, of the
Mhm.
earth, right? So it's in her way of being with the poor, of being with people in need, of welcoming everyone around her, that sets her so firmly in an ecological mindset that she was showing us what to do without saying do good things for the earth. She talked about snowflakes. She talked about remora fish steering a ship. She talked about all of her examples, and we don't have a lot of writing from her because they were destroyed in fires so many times over the years. But what we do have is so founded in creation, and you can so imagine Canada in the 17th century, just the enormousness and the vastness of everything. You couldn't help but to be reliant on God. You couldn't help but to see God everywhere. And that's what fueled her to go out and help people. And I think that's the call for us, for me in writing this chapter, is how can becoming more simple help to lessen my footprint on the earth, but also then propel me to energize me to go work with so many others to help those in need. That's part of the environmental call, I think.
Mhm. Well, thank you, because I didn't know that much about her. I thought it was, I'm not just flattering you, I thought it was one of the best chapters in the
Oh,
book. It was beautifully written, and but there's so much in here, and each one of these chapters could be expanded into to a book. I'm so grateful to you for bringing them all together. I think it's a wonderful contribution, and I think it's a real next step in our talking about uh, ecological spirituality and how we promote that kind of ecological conversion that Pope Francis talks about, because it's embodied in how we live our lives, how we express our faith, how we respond to our own call for holiness in the context of the threats that our earth is experiencing. So
fabulous.
I want to thank you very much. Wonderful talking with you, and urge everybody to read this fantastic book, Green Saints for a Green Generation. Thank you.
Thank you.